In the early 1980s, the Soviet military looked at what the Americans were doing with the AH-64 Apache program and decided that the entire concept of a two-seat attack helicopter with a dedicated pilot and a dedicated gunner was fundamentally wrong. Not because the Americans were bad engineers or because the Apache was a bad helicopter, but because the Soviet analysis of how attack helicopters would actually be used in a high-intensity war in Europe led to conclusions about crew workload and aircraft survivability that pointed in a completely different direction, toward a single-seat helicopter with no gunner at all, a machine that would rely on automated systems and a helmet-mounted sight to allow one pilot to do everything that two crew members did in conventional attack helicopters. And the helicopter that emerged from this analysis after years of development and competition between rival design bureaus was the Ka-50 Black Shark, a machine so unconventional and so technically ambitious that even the engineers who built it spent years arguing about whether it was a revolutionary breakthrough or an incredibly sophisticated way to get a single pilot killed over a European battlefield. The competition that produced the Ka-50 began in 1976 when the Soviet military issued a requirement for a new dedicated attack helicopter to replace the Mi-24 Hind in the anti-tank role, and the requirement specifically called for a helicopter optimized for the destruction of NATO armor rather than the combination of anti-tank capability and troop transport that had shaped the Mi-24's design, and that Soviet planners had concluded was a compromise that served neither role as well as a dedicated platform could. Two design bureaus competed for the contract. The Mill Bureau, which proposed a conventional two-seat tandem cockpit design that evolved into what would eventually become the Mi-28 Havoc, and the Kamov Bureau, which proposed something completely different, a single-seat helicopter using the coaxial contra-rotating rotor system that Kamov had been building into its naval helicopters for decades, combined with an automated weapons management system sophisticated enough to allow one pilot to fly the aircraft and operate all of its weapons without any assistance from a second crew member. The Soviet military evaluated both designs extensively, and in 1984 made the decision to proceed with the Kamov design, a decision that was controversial at the time, and that remained controversial for years afterward, as the two competing philosophies of attack helicopter design continued to be debated within the Russian military establishment. The coaxial rotor system that was the most immediately visible feature of the Ka-50 was not simply a design preference, but a fundamental technical choice with significant tactical implications, because eliminating the tail rotor that conventional helicopters needed to counteract the torque of their main rotor removed an entire category of combat damage vulnerability from the aircraft. The tail rotor of a conventional attack helicopter was a mechanical system exposed at the end of a long tail boom, connected to the main transmission by a drive shaft running the length of the fuselage, and damage to any part of this system from enemy fire could make the helicopter uncontrollable almost instantly, because without tail rotor thrust, there was nothing to stop the fuselage from spinning in the opposite direction to the main rotor, a failure mode that had destroyed a significant number of helicopters in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and numerous other conflicts, and that represented a genuine tactical vulnerability that skilled enemy gunners specifically targeted. The Ka-50's coaxial system used two rotors spinning in opposite directions on the same shaft, each canceling the torque of the other, which meant there was no tail rotor and therefore no tail rotor vulnerability, and the absence of the tail boom and tail rotor assembly also made the aircraft significantly more compact than a conventional helicopter of similar rotor diameter, giving it advantages in operating from confined spaces and in terrain masking. The performance characteristics that the coaxial system gave the Ka-50 went beyond simply eliminating the tail rotor vulnerability, because the contra-rotating rotors could be controlled independently to generate yaw forces directly from the main rotor system, rather than relying on tail rotor thrust, which gave the aircraft a level of maneuverability that conventional attack helicopters could not match, and that allowed Kamov's test pilots to demonstrate aerobatic maneuvers during flight testing that made observers question whether what they were watching was actually a helicopter, rather than some kind of fixed-wing aircraft that happened to have rotors. The Ka-50 could perform loops, rolls, and extremely rapid direction changes that were outside the flight envelope of any conventional attack helicopter. And while these extreme maneuvers were not necessarily what the aircraft would be doing in combat operations, they demonstrated a fundamental agility that translated into real tactical advantages in terms of how quickly the aircraft could reposition between firing passes, how rapidly it could break away from an engagement when threatened, and how effectively it could use terrain masking to approach targets and then expose itself only briefly to fire before returning to cover. The single-seat cockpit and the automated weapons management system that made single-pilot operation possible were the most technically ambitious aspects of the Ka-50 program, and the aspects that generated the most debate within the Soviet and later Russian military establishment, because the question of whether one pilot could really manage everything that needed to be managed during a demanding combat mission was not a question that could be answered definitively in ground testing or even in flight testing under controlled conditions. And the honest answer was that nobody really knew until the aircraft was used in actual combat operations against a competent enemy that was actively trying to kill it. The system that Kamov developed to make single-pilot operation workable was built around a helmet-mounted sight called the Shkval targeting system, combined with an autopilot capable enough to maintain the aircraft in stable flight, while the pilot focused attention on target acquisition and weapons employment, the idea being that the pilot could designate a target by looking at it through the helmet sight, confirm the designation, select the appropriate weapon, and fire without having to manually slave the targeting system to the line of sight through a separate set of controls while simultaneously flying the aircraft. The Viker anti-tank missile that was the Ka-50's primary weapon against armored vehicles was a laser beam riding weapon with a maximum engagement range of 8 kilometers and a tandem-shaped charge warhead specifically designed to defeat tanks equipped with explosive reactive armor, which was the armor configuration that Soviet planners expected NATO tanks to be using when the war they were designing the Ka-50 to fight actually started. The laser beam riding guidance system meant that the missile flew along a laser beam, projected from the aircraft to the target, requiring the pilot to keep the laser pointed at the target throughout the missile's flight time, which at maximum range was approximately 11 seconds. And maintaining that laser designation while flying the aircraft and monitoring the tactical situation around it was exactly the kind of task that pushed the boundaries of what a single pilot could manage effectively, particularly during multiple simultaneous engagements against targets that were actively maneuvering and firing back. The two A-42 30mm cannon that complemented the missile armament was borrowed directly from the BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle and was significantly more powerful than the cannons fitted to most other attack helicopters, capable of firing either high explosive or armor-piercing ammunition at selectable rates of fire, and able to engage both ground targets and slow-flying aerial threats with genuine effectiveness. The ejection system developed for the Ka-50 was one of the most technically challenging aspects of the entire program, because the problem of ejecting a pilot from a helicopter with rotor blades spinning above the cockpit had no simple solution, and the system that Kamov's engineers developed was both ingenious and somewhat alarming in its approach to the problem, using explosive charges to blow all of the rotor blades off the aircraft in the fraction of a second before the ejection seat fired upward through the now clear space above the cockpit. The timing of this sequence had to be precise enough that the blades were gone before the seat reached the rotor hub, but fast enough that the seat fired before the aircraft had time to begin the uncontrolled descent that would follow the loss of rotor thrust, and the entire sequence from initiation to pilot clear of the aircraft took approximately 2.5 seconds, during which an enormous amount had to go exactly right in exactly the right order for the crew member to survive. The system was designed to function across the entire flight envelope, including from a hovering aircraft at 0 forward speed, and it was tested extensively in ground rigs and eventually in live ejection tests before being certified for operational use. The Ka-50 entered limited service with Russian forces in 1995 after a development process that had been severely disrupted by the collapse of Soviet funding in the early 1990s. With only a small number of production aircraft completed before the program ran into the financial constraints that affected virtually every Russian defense program during that period. The aircraft's combat debut came in Chechnya in 2000 and 2001, when a small detachment of K-50S was deployed for operational evaluation in actual combat conditions, flying missions in support of Russian ground forces against Chechen fighters in the mountainous terrain of the Caucasus. And the results of this deployment were instructive in ways that confirmed some of the design's strengths, while also revealing the limitations of the single-pilot concept in the demanding operational environment of actual combat. The Ka-50 demonstrated genuine capability in the weapons delivery role, and the coaxial rotor system performed well in the mountain environment, where the thin air at altitude degraded the performance of conventional helicopters more significantly than it affected the Ka-50. But the workload placed on the single pilot during missions that required navigation through complex terrain, combined with threat awareness and weapons employment, was high enough that the evaluation confirmed the concerns that had been raised about the single pilot concept throughout the development program. The lessons from the Chechen deployment directly influenced the development of the Ka-52 two-seat variant, but the Ka-50 itself remained a remarkable achievement in helicopter design, a machine that had pushed the boundaries of what automated systems could allow a single pilot to accomplish, and that had demonstrated the genuine tactical advantages of the coaxial rotor configuration in combat conditions, even if the ultimate conclusion was that those advantages were better exploited with 2 crew members than with 1. The small number of K-50S that were built remained in Russian service as a specialized platform, and the aircraft continued to be used for testing and evaluation of new systems and weapons. Its coaxial rotor system and its ejection seat design, representing genuine innovations in helicopter technology that influenced subsequent Russian rotary wing development in ways that extended well beyond the specific program that produced them.